Welcome to this video. We are about to embark on an exploration that might feel challenging, perhaps even unsettling. Our topic today sits at a provocative intersection: the contemporary culture surrounding safe spaces and the deep, often demanding, psychological insights of Carl Gustav Jung. The title itself, "Jung Would Laugh at Your Safe Spaces," is intentionally striking. It's not merely for effect, but poses a genuine inquiry grounded in the core principles of analytical psychology. How would the man who dedicated his life to exploring the vast, often terrifying landscape of the human psyche perceive the modern emphasis on creating environments meticulously shielded from discomfort, challenge, and potentially offensive ideas? In this discussion, we will argue that Carl Jung, while undoubtedly possessing deep compassion for genuine trauma and acknowledging the fundamental human need for basic security, would likely regard the proliferation and specific philosophy underpinning many contemporary safe spaces with a profound skepticism bordering on amusement. Not a mocking laughter, perhaps, but the deep, knowing chuckle of someone recognizing a fundamental, albeit well-intentioned, misunderstanding of the path towards psychological wholeness, towards what he termed individuation. He might see these spaces as attempts to circumvent the very friction, the necessary grinding and polishing, that life demands for the development of a resilient and integrated soul. Jung's entire psychological framework is built upon the difficult synthesis of opposites: the courageous willingness to descend into the underworld of the personal and collective unconscious, and the arduous, lifelong process of becoming a unique, whole individual. This journey, as Jung described it, is the antithesis of safe. It demands engagement with the ambiguous, the threatening, the parts of existence and ourselves that we would rather avoid. So let's delve into this complex territory, examining why the founder of analytical psychology, a thinker fascinated by the alchemical transformation of base lead into precious gold through fire and dissolution, would likely find the modern pursuit of perpetual intellectual and emotional safety to be a significant detour, possibly even a dead end, on the path to realizing our full human potential. Before we proceed further into Jung's perspective, it is essential to clarify what we mean by safe spaces in the context of this video. The term originated with commendable intentions, often within feminist and LGBTQ+ activism circles. It initially referred to physical locations where individuals from marginalized communities could find refuge from tangible threats such as prejudice, harassment, discrimination, and violence. These were sanctuaries offering vital support, solidarity, and respite from the dangers present in a hostile external world. Jung, who thoroughly analyzed the impact of societal pressures, collective norms, and historical trauma on the individual psyche, would almost certainly have understood and respected the critical need for such havens for those facing genuine persecution and systemic oppression. He recognized the reality of external threats and the psychological damage they inflict. However, the concept has undergone a significant expansion and transformation, particularly within academic institutions, corporate environments, online communities, and even some therapeutic settings. Today, the term safe space frequently implies an environment meticulously curated to be free not only from overt hostility and targeted bigotry, but also from ideas, language, microaggressions, or discussions that might induce psychological discomfort, challenge deeply ingrained beliefs, trigger negative emotional responses, or potentially evoke past trauma, often defined quite broadly. the emphasis shifts markedly from safety from concrete harm or prejudice to safety from intellectual friction, emotional disturbance, or the mere possibility of feeling offended. Consequently, trigger warnings, content advisories, the careful policing of language, and the prioritization of subjective feelings over objective discourse become paramount. It is this expanded, pervasive interpretation of the safe space ethos, this culture of safetyism, applied to the realm of ideas, learning, and personal development, that creates a fundamental conflict with the Jungian worldview. It rests on the assumption that psychological growth thrives best in the absence of challenge, that learning can occur without discomfort, and that emotional well-being is primarily achieved by eliminating potential stressors rather than by developing the internal resilience and capacity to navigate them effectively. This is precisely where Jung's hypothetical, perhaps somewhat melancholic, amusement and deep concern would likely surface. Now, let's bring Carl Jung more clearly into focus. A Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, Jung was initially a close collaborator and designated heir of Sigmund Freud. However, significant theoretical disagreements led him to break away and establish his own distinct school of thought, analytical psychology. His work ventured far beyond Freud's primary emphasis on repressed sexuality and early childhood experiences, exploring the vast, transpersonal dimensions of the psyche. He introduced groundbreaking concepts such as the collective unconscious, a shared reservoir of inherited psychic structures and potentials common to all humanity, archetypes, the universal primordial patterns of experience and imagery that emerge from the collective unconscious, such as the hero, the mother, the trickster, the wise old man, and critically for our discussion, the shadow, the self, the central archetype representing wholeness, integration, and the ultimate goal of psychological development, and the individuation process itself, the often challenging, lifelong journey towards realizing the self and becoming a fully differentiated, integrated human being. Jung's work consistently underscored the necessity of confronting, acknowledging, and integrating the rejected, ignored, repressed, or feared aspects of oneself and the world. For Jung, the psyche was not a delicate flower to be perpetually shielded from harsh weather, but a dynamic, self-regulating system, striving for balance through the tension of opposites. It was both a battlefield where consciousness struggles against unconscious forces, and a crucible where the personality is forged and refined through intense heat and pressure. Perhaps the single most critical Jungian concept for understanding his likely perspective on modern safe spaces is the shadow. The shadow archetype embodies the dark side of our personality. It is the sum total of all those unpleasant, unacceptable, or underdeveloped qualities that we prefer to hide, not only from others, but also from ourselves. It encompasses everything the conscious ego denies, represses, projects, or simply fails to recognize about itself. Our greed, envy, anger, laziness, cruelty, fears, vulnerabilities, irrationalities, and prejudices. However, the shadow is not purely negative or evil in itself. It is simply that part of us which remains unconscious and unacknowledged. Paradoxically, it can also contain positive qualities that our conscious ego or societal conditioning has deemed unacceptable, undeveloped talents, creative impulses, authentic assertiveness, or instinctual wisdom. Our gold often lies hidden in this darkness. Jung was adamant that ignoring or repressing the shadow does not make it disappear. On the contrary, Repression only strengthens its autonomous power. An unacknowledged shadow operates behind the scenes, influencing our behavior in unconscious ways, often leading to destructive outcomes like self-sabotage, inexplicable moods, neurotic symptoms, and compulsive behaviors. Crucially, we project our unacknowledged shadow onto others. We attribute the very traits we cannot face in ourselves onto individuals, groups, or ideas that we dislike or fear. This projection mechanism is a primary engine of prejudice, conflict, scapegoating, and misunderstanding in human affairs. Think of the individual who constantly criticizes others for their perceived arrogance while remaining completely blind to their own hubris. Consider the group that defines itself by its supposed moral purity while demonizing an outgroup onto whom all negativity and perceived evil are projected. This is the shadow at work on both personal and collective levels. Jung insisted that the first courageous step towards self-knowledge, towards genuine psychological development and individuation, is the withdrawal of these projections and the conscious confrontation with one's own shadow. This is profoundly uncomfortable, often painful and humbling work. It requires rigorous honesty, self-reflection, and the courage to acknowledge the darkness within. It means recognizing that the mote we perceive so clearly in our brother's eye might be a reflection of the beam obstructing our own vision. How does this directly relate to the ethos of safe spaces? If a safe space is defined by the systematic exclusion of challenging ideas, uncomfortable truths, dissenting voices, or individuals who embody perspectives we find threatening or disagreeable, it becomes an environment actively designed to prevent shadow confrontation by shielding individuals from viewpoints or experiences that might trigger their own unacknowledged biases, fears, insecurities, or repressed contents. Such spaces inadvertently encourage the continuation and reinforcement of shadow projection. The other, the dissenting voice, the challenging text, the unsafe idea. These often function as vital mirrors, reflecting back to us aspects of our own hidden psyche. Avoiding the mirror means avoiding the opportunity for self-awareness and integration. A space meticulously curated to eliminate offense and discomfort risks becoming an echo chamber, a collective bubble where personal and collective shadows run rampant, unexamined, unacknowledged, and freely projected onto the world outside. Jung would argue forcefully that true psychological health and maturity require integrating the shadow, making its contents conscious, understanding its motivations, and ultimately harnessing its considerable energy in constructive ways. This integration can only happen through encounter, through friction, through the willingness to look squarely at what repulses, frightens, or angers us, both in the external world and, more importantly, within ourselves. A space designed to eliminate such encounters, however noble the stated intention, fundamentally obstructs this crucial developmental task. It fosters psychological fragility by denying the ego the necessary challenges required to strengthen it, differentiate it, and integrate its darker complementary half. Jung might suggest that attempting to create a world without shadows is akin to trying to create a world without depth or substance. It results in a flattened, unreal, and ultimately stagnant psychic landscape. The ultimate goal of Jung's psychology, the guiding principle of his life's work, is individuation. This is not synonymous with mere individualism in the sense of selfish isolation or eccentricity. Rather, it is the complex, lifelong process of becoming an individual, a whole, undivided person, psychologically distinct from collective norms and expectations. Yet consciously, related to the broader human community and the deep wellspring of the collective unconscious. It is the journey towards realizing one's unique potential, guided by the regulating center of the psyche, the self-archetype. Jung described this as the central task of human life, particularly in the second half of life, and he emphasized that it is often fraught with peril, difficulty, and suffering. It involves differentiating oneself from the limiting expectations of parents, society, and the persona, the socially acceptable mask we wear to navigate the world. It requires navigating the often treacherous waters of the unconscious, confronting not only the personal shadow, but also powerful, numinous archetypal forces like the anima, the inner feminine principle in men, and the animus, the inner masculine principle in women, and potentially overwhelming encounters with the raw power of the collective unconscious itself. This journey frequently involves periods of intense disorientation, suffering, breakdown, and chaos, symbolized vividly in the alchemical tradition, which Jung studied deeply, by the nigredo stage. This is the initial blackening, the dissolution of the old, rigid structures of the personality, a necessary descent into darkness before a new, more conscious integration can occur. Think of the ubiquitous narrative pattern found across cultures and throughout history, the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell, heavily influenced by Jung, mapped this structure. The hero is called away from the familiar, safe world. They must cross a threshold into a realm of adventure and danger. They face a series of trials, tribulations, and encounters with monsters, often symbolizing internal demons, unresolved complexes, or shadow aspects. They undergo a central ordeal, a symbolic death and rebirth. They seize a treasure or gain a crucial insight, self-knowledge, integration, a boon for the community. And finally, they face the difficult task of returning to the ordinary world, transformed and charged with integrating their newfound wisdom into life. This archetypal narrative powerfully reflects the deep structure of the individuation process. It is never depicted as easy, comfortable, or safe. The hero must leave the safe space of the village, the known world, and venture into the dangerous forest, the underworld, the belly of the beast. They must face monsters, solve riddles, endure hardship, confront their deepest fears. It is precisely through navigating these challenges, through embracing the unsafety of the quest, that the hero develops strength, courage, wisdom, resilience, and character, ultimately achieving transformation. Modern safe spaces, particularly in their iteration focused on avoiding intellectual and emotional discomfort, appear designed to prevent the call to adventure altogether, or at least to thoroughly sanitize the dangerous forest, padding the path with trigger warnings, affirmation circles, and escape routes, thereby eliminating the very challenges that foster growth. From a Jungian perspective, this attempt to bypass the inherent difficulties, the necessary suffering, embedded in the individuation path, is not only futile, but profoundly counterproductive. True psychological growth, the kind that leads to lasting resilience, genuine wisdom, and a deeply felt sense of meaning and purpose, requires grappling with adversity. It demands the development of what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension of opposites, learning to tolerate ambiguity, paradox, internal conflict, and external challenges without collapsing, retreating into one-sided certainty, or demanding premature resolution. Shielding individuals from challenging encounters, difficult dialogues, and uncomfortable feelings prevents the development of this crucial psychological muscle. It fosters dependence, reinforces avoidance behaviors, and prevents the discovery of latent inner resources and strengths. The path to the self, the journey towards wholeness, Jung would undoubtedly insist, leads directly through the territories clearly marked unsafe and uncomfortable. Let's delve deeper into the mechanism of projection. As previously mentioned, we unconsciously attribute aspects of our own psyche, particularly the unacknowledged shadow, onto other people, groups, or even abstract ideas. This is a universal human tendency, a primitive defense mechanism that temporarily protects the ego from confronting painful or unacceptable truths about itself. However, persistent and unacknowledged projection is toxic. It poisons relationships, fuels interpersonal and intergroup conflict, hinders empathy, prevents genuine communication, and fundamentally obstructs self-understanding. Jung believed that the withdrawal of projections is not merely a psychological task, but a moral one, essential for both individual development and collective peace. How do we achieve this withdrawal? Primarily through conscious engagement with the people and ideas onto whom we are projecting. It is often in the difficult, uncomfortable, friction-filled interactions with the other, the person holding opposing political views, the colleague whose work style grates on us, the cultural group whose customs seem alien or offensive, the text that challenges our core beliefs, that we are forced to confront the possibility that our intense emotional reactions might reveal more about our own internal landscape than about the external stimulus. These encounters serve as invaluable mirrors. If we shatter the mirror, refuse to look into it, or demand that the mirror only show us pleasing reflections, we remain trapped in our own unconscious biases. Blind spots and projected shadows. Safe spaces, particularly those that enforce ideological homogeneity, discourage dissent, or prioritize emotional comfort above intellectual exploration, can inadvertently become powerful incubators of projection. When disagreement is framed as inherently unsafe or harmful, and dissenting voices are systematically silenced, marginalized, or excluded, the group's collective shadow, its shared unacknowledged biases, fears, and aggressions can easily be projected onto the excluded other, whether that other is an individual, another group, or an abstract concept. The group may feel internally cohesive, virtuous, and unified against the perceived threat, but this unity is often superficial, built upon a foundation of unexamined negativity, scapegoating, and a collective refusal to engage in critical self-reflection. Individuals within such a group are deprived of the challenging encounters that could potentially disrupt their complacency, prompt them to question their own assumptions, and facilitate the difficult but necessary process of recognizing and withdrawing their projections. Ironically, the space meticulously designed for safety can foster a profound lack of self-awareness and actually deepen psychological divides by reinforcing us versus them thinking. Jung would likely advocate for spaces that bravely facilitate difficult dialogues, foster mutual understanding across differences, and encourage rigorous self-examination, not spaces that preemptively shut down potential conflict in the name of comfort. He understood that true community and authentic connection are forged not through superficial agreement or enforced conformity, but through the challenging, often messy work of navigating differences honestly, which requires acknowledging and working through the projections that inevitably arise in human interaction. Engagement with the other, even the challenging, provocative, or seemingly offensive other, is essential psychic hygiene, a prerequisite for both individual growth and collective sanity. Jung frequently and forcefully warned against the dangers of psychological one-sidedness. The human psyche, he argued, naturally strives for balance and wholeness. When consciousness becomes too rigidly identified with one particular attitude, function, or perspective, whether it's excessive rationality at the expense of feeling, extreme extroversion neglecting the inner world of introversion, dogmatic adherence to a specific ideology while demonizing all alternatives, or clinging to light while denying darkness. The neglected, repressed aspects inevitably build up pressure in the unconscious. This psychic imbalance can lead to a range of psychological problems. One potential outcome is inflation, where the ego becomes unconsciously identified with an archetype, often the self or the shadow, leading to an unrealistic sense of power, righteousness, grandiosity, or infallibility, coupled with a loss of human connection and grounding. The opposite outcome is deflation, a state of chronic powerlessness, inferiority, and depression. Perhaps most dramatically, extreme one-sidedness can lead to sudden involuntary eruptions from the unconscious, where the repressed opposite bursts forth in uncontrolled, often destructive ways. Think of the hyper-rational individual who suddenly succumbs to irrational impulses, the overly pious person caught in scandalous behavior, or the rigidly controlled society that erupts in violence and chaos. These are often manifestations of extreme psychological imbalance, the psyche's desperate attempt to restore equilibrium. Safe spaces, by their very nature of filtering out challenging, dissenting, or unsafe perspectives, inherently risk cultivating and reinforcing psychological one-sidedness. When the primary goal is to maintain emotional comfort and avoid offense at all costs, viewpoints that challenge the dominant consensus or introduce uncomfortable complexity are often marginalized, dismissed, or actively excluded. This creates an environment where certain ideas, attitudes, and emotional responses are constantly validated and reinforced, while others are deemed unacceptable, dangerous, or simply unthinkable. Participants within such spaces may develop an inflated sense of their own virtue, the unquestionable correctness of their views, and the inherent wrongness or danger of opposing perspectives. Their psychological landscape becomes narrower, less flexible, less tolerant of ambiguity or nuance, and ultimately more brittle and vulnerable. Jung believed passionately that psychological health and maturity require the development of the capacity to hold the tension between opposites consciously. This means acknowledging the potential kernel of truth or validity in opposing viewpoints, even if we fundamentally disagree with them. It involves recognizing the shadow aspects lurking within our own most cherished beliefs and ideologies, and conversely, seeing the potential value or insight hidden within what we instinctively reject or fear. It requires embracing complexity, paradox, and ambiguity, rather than retreating into simplistic, polarized binaries of safe versus unsafe, good versus evil, us versus them. Safe spaces, by attempting to eliminate this essential psychic tension in favor of a predefined good, correct, or safe perspective, can inadvertently hinder the development of psychological maturity, critical thinking, and genuine resilience. They foster a fragile consensus, an illusion of harmony that is easily shattered when confronted with the messy, contradictory, and often challenging reality of the world outside the protective bubble. What about genuine suffering and trauma? This is a critical point, requiring careful consideration to avoid misinterpretation. Jung was intimately familiar with profound human suffering, both through his own personal experiences, including a significant period of intense inner turmoil he called his confrontation with the unconscious, and through his extensive clinical work with patients experiencing severe psychological distress, including soldiers traumatized by war. He would absolutely recognize the devastating reality of trauma and the crucial need for specialized therapeutic environments, compassionate support, and secure settings conducive to healing for individuals who have endured abuse, violence, severe loss, or other forms of overwhelming psychological injury. Providing refuge, skilled therapeutic intervention, and a supportive community for those genuinely traumatized is entirely consistent with a deep and compassionate understanding of the human condition. There is no conflict here. However, Jung's likely critique would focus on the crucial distinction between these necessary therapeutic contexts for trauma recovery and the much broader, often indiscriminate application of safetyism to general public discourse, educational settings, artistic expression, and the everyday challenges of life. His concern would likely center on the increasing tendency to pathologize normal human experiences of discomfort, disagreement, intellectual challenge, and emotional distress, treating them as if they were inherently traumatic or harmful. This conflation, he might argue, fosters a culture of avoidance, hypersensitivity, and psychological fragility, rather than promoting the development of coping mechanisms, emotional regulation skills, and robust resilience. Jung held a perspective on suffering that contrasts sharply with the modern tendency to view it solely as something negative to be eradicated at all costs. While he certainly did not advocate seeking out needless pain or glorifying suffering for its own sake, he saw it as an intrinsic, unavoidable part of the human condition, and crucially, often as a powerful catalyst for profound psychological growth, the discovery of meaning, and the process of transformation. One of his most famous statements is, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." This provocative assertion suggests that avoiding the necessary pains and challenges inherent in life, the existential anxieties, the confrontations with our limitations, the grief of loss, the struggle with our shadows, does not lead to happiness, but can paradoxically result in psychological stagnation, neurotic symptoms, or a sense of meaninglessness. He also stated unequivocally, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. The process of becoming more aware, of integrating unconscious material, of differentiating oneself from the collective, of individuating. This inherently involves confronting difficult truths, relinquishing cherished illusions, and experiencing the discomfort that accompanies genuine change. Trying to engineer a life, or an educational experience, or a social environment entirely devoid of such pain is, from a Jungian perspective, an attempt to short-circuit the process of psychological development itself, an attempt to avoid the very experiences that forge consciousness and character." The alchemical metaphor, so central to Jung's later work, provides a powerful illustration. Alchemy, in its symbolic sense, sought the transformation of base matter, lead, representing the unrefined, unconscious psyche, into gold, representing the integrated, individuated self. This transformation was not achieved through gentle handling or protective measures. It required subjecting the base matter to intense, often violent processes. Solutio, dissolution in corrosive acids, breaking down old forms. Coagulatio, precipitation, bringing disparate elements together. Calcinatio, intense burning in fire, purification through destruction. Sublimatio, vaporization and condensation at a higher level. Refinement. These stages symbolize the psychological processes of breakdown, purification through suffering and confrontation, and eventual reintegration into a more conscious and whole state. Jung saw this as a profound map of the individuation journey. Psychological transformation requires facing the fire of conflict, suffering, intense emotion, and the confrontation with unconscious contents. Safe spaces, in their explicit emphasis on avoiding the heat, on preventing the dissolution and burning, seem to aim for the preservation of the lead, rather than its transformation into gold. They risk keeping the individual psyche safe but unchanged, comfortable but unrefined, protected but ultimately unrealized. Furthermore, Jung placed immense emphasis on the role of meaning in navigating suffering. He famously remarked that the crucial question is not why people suffer, but how they find meaning in their suffering. Meaning, he believed, makes even intense suffering bearable and potentially transformative. If our primary cultural goal becomes the elimination of all potential sources of discomfort, challenge, or offense, we may inadvertently eliminate the very opportunities to wrestle with difficulty, overcome adversity, and thereby discover the profound sense of meaning and purpose that often arises from such struggles. A life meticulously curated for maximum safety and minimal friction might paradoxically become a life lacking the depth, richness, and significance that comes precisely from grappling with the difficult, the ambiguous, and the painful aspects of existence. Finally, let us consider the collective implications of this trend. A society increasingly preoccupied with avoiding intellectual and emotional discomfort may become progressively less capable of confronting its own collective shadow, its unresolved historical traumas, its systemic injustices, its ingrained prejudices, its ecological crises, its complex geopolitical challenges. If difficult conversations about race, history, politics, or religion are routinely shut down as unsafe, how can genuine societal understanding, reconciliation, and progress occur? If challenging established narratives, questioning authority, or expressing unpopular opinions is framed as inherently harmful or violent, how can collective blind spots be illuminated and addressed? Jung, having lived through the catastrophic rise of totalitarianism in Europe, was deeply concerned with the psychology of groups, crowds, and nations. He recognized that unacknowledged and projected collective shadows could accumulate immense destructive power, leading to mass delusion, scapegoating, and devastating violence. A pervasive culture of safetyism, while perhaps ostensibly intending to protect vulnerable individuals, might inadvertently weaken the collective psyche's ability to engage in the necessary critical self-reflection. Robust debate, and courageous confrontation with uncomfortable truths that are essential for societal health, adaptation, and ethical evolution. It risks creating societal echo chambers where dissent is pathologized, critical thinking atrophies, projections run rampant, and the capacity for navigating complex realities diminishes, leaving the society more vulnerable to manipulation and regression. So, to return to our initial question, would Jung laugh? Perhaps laugh is too simple, too dismissive a word. It might be a laughter tinged with deep concern, a profound sigh of recognition, seeing a well-intentioned impulse veer significantly off course. He might perceive a societal trend moving away from the demanding but ultimately rewarding path of integration, self-knowledge, and resilience, towards an alluring but ultimately illusory promise of safety that hinders the very psychological development it purports to support. He might see it as a collective manifestation of the puer aeternus, the eternal child archetype, a reluctance to embrace the full responsibilities and challenges of psychological adulthood, which inevitably include confronting the darkness within and without. Jung would likely argue with unwavering conviction that true psychological safety is not found in external buffers against discomfort, but in the cultivation of internal strength, flexibility, wisdom, and wholeness, qualities developed precisely through facing, engaging with, and integrating life's inevitable challenges and shadows. True safety lies in the courage to explore the frightening depths of one's own psyche, to wrestle with the shadow, to hold the tension of opposites without collapsing, and to bravely embark on the lifelong, perilous, yet profoundly meaningful journey of individuation. In conclusion, while fully acknowledging the critical importance of protecting individuals from genuine harm, abuse, and trauma, the pervasive modern ethos of safe spaces, specifically aimed at eliminating intellectual friction and emotional discomfort, stands in fundamental opposition to the core tenets of Jungian psychology. Jung's profound emphasis on shadow integration, the arduous nature of the individuation path, the necessity of confronting and holding the tension of opposites, the crucial task of withdrawing projections, and the potentially transformative power inherent in suffering, all point towards a worldview where challenge, conflict, ambiguity, and discomfort are not merely unfortunate obstacles to be avoided, but are in fact essential, indispensable catalysts for psychological growth, the discovery of meaning, and the development of a robust, resilient, and truly integrated personality. From this deep psychological perspective, the relentless pursuit of perpetual safety represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the human condition, a potential impediment to the very wholeness and self-realization it ostensibly seeks to achieve. Jung might gently, or perhaps forcefully, suggest that instead of building ever higher and thicker walls to keep the challenging world out, we should be diligently cultivating the inner resources, the psychological fortitude, and the conscious awareness required to meet that world openly, learn from its difficulties, and ultimately be transformed by the encounter. That is the demanding, inherently unsafe, yet profoundly rewarding path towards becoming who we are truly meant to be. Thank you for watching this exploration of complex and perhaps challenging ideas. We encourage you to reflect on these concepts further. Until next time, continue your own journey into the depths.